Okay, so today we're going to be making cinnamon rolls. I happened to grab this recipe from Alton Brown's Good Eats too. I love Alton Brown as a chef to give to other people who are still learning or who are looking to improve their skills. His recipes are very easy to follow, they are very straightforward, and they tend to have a margin of error built in. So they're made to give you some wiggle room. So with his particular cinnamon roll recipe, they're made to go into the refrigerator overnight so that you can pop them out in the morning, let them sit for no more than 30 minutes, and then put them straight into the oven and enjoy your breakfast. We're going to start off with making our dough, and cinnamon roll dough is a yeasted dough. What this means is that it uses yeast as opposed to baking soda, baking powder, etc. to leaven or to rise. With Corona going on, the recipe calls for instant yeast, but I only happen to have active dry yeast. If that happens to you, you use about a quarter more. So if the recipe calls for a packet, which this one does, I used about a packet and a quarter. So I still have a little bit of leftover for some bread later. With active dry yeast, as opposed to instant yeast, you need to bloom it first, which means putting it into room temperature or slightly warm water to let the yeast wake up. Yeast is a live single-celled organism, and it's through eating sugars that it produces the gas that makes your bread rise. So in this case, I have my packet and a quarter here. I've been letting it bloom, or to wake up, for a little bit, and then I should be ready to go. With the instant yeast, which is what the recipe originally calls for, you just have to add it straight to your dough. It'll wake up and do the process while you're mixing. Okay, so for my dough, if you looked at the recipe prior to this video, we're looking at 4 yolks, 1 whole egg, 2 ounces of sugar, 6 tablespoons of melted butter, 3/4 cup of buttermilk, 20 ounces, and that's by weight, of all-purpose flour. I have my yeast here, so 1 packet of instant or 1 1/4 packets of active dry, and 1 1/4 teaspoon of salt. So let's look at the eggs first, and then we'll move on to our flour, because dealing with these can be their own issue. Okay, so if you notice, our recipe calls for 4 yolks and a single egg. There are many different ways that you could take the yolk out and separate it from the egg, but I have my favorite after working in large-scale kitchens. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to crack my eggs, and these I can do, I'd probably say 3 to 4 at a time maximum. So we need 4, we'll do 4. Crack them without breaking the yolk. That's really important, so be extra gentle as you're cracking. And you're going to empty them into a single bowl. Once I've got my 4 yolks in, as you can see, I'm going to go ahead and take the yolks themselves out. Let me throw my egg over here. So I know I need my 4 yolks and my single egg together for my dough. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer the yolks over here, and I will eventually add my whole egg to that. Now, some people like to do the shell back and forth. One of the things I struggle with that is it's very easy to catch the yolk on the shell and end up ripping the yolk open. And that way, if you need to separate, it does make it more difficult. So I was always taught using hands. Please make sure your hands are super clean before and after. You do need to wash them. You don't want any cross-contamination. We'll also wipe down our board afterward as well. So you go in gently and just let the egg transfer back and forth. If you notice, I'm keeping my fingers loose. I'm letting that white flow through. The white will separate off of the yolk and go back into my bowl. Now, some people toss it out if they don't have any other projects later that day. I really enjoy saving those egg whites. They're great for a number of things, whether it's meringue, if you're a friend of macaron. Macaron are made with egg whites, and then a number of other recipes. They're great as washes for various biscuits, doughs, pies, etc. So I've got my egg whites over here now, and if you notice, it's a pretty clean separation. It also is a little bit easier this way to go through and grab any particles that happen to come out if those egg yolks burst open. We call those goldfish. If I keep it down to 4 eggs at a time. So if I'm doing a larger recipe that requires 6, 8, 12 eggs, which when I've done multiple cheesecakes at one time, that's definitely happened, I will do no more than 4, usually 2 or 3 eggs at a time to separate those yolks out, just in case one breaks. I don't end up ruining the whole batch. Certain recipes are very particular about their need for very clean egg whites, and the fat from the yolk will ruin the ability of the whites to fluff up. All right, so now I can take my individual egg and add it to my yolks. And now I've got, in this left bowl, or right for you guys, 4 yolks and 1 whole egg. This leads me back to our next step for our dough, which is going to be our flour. Okay, now that I've gone and cleaned and sanitized my board, set my eggs off to the side, and washed my hands thoroughly, I can go on to the next step of measurements. If you'll notice for most of the ingredients for today, I already have them pre-measured just for time's sake for the video, but I do want to talk about flour for a minute. So a lot of home cooks especially measure their flour wrong. If it calls for volumetric measurements, so we're talking about cups, tablespoons, quarter cups, you want to very cautiously make sure that you are scooping your flour into the measuring ingredient, scraping off the top and adding it in. Most people will either go in and scoop with their measuring cup or pack the flour in. Recipes are written for that scooped flour. Flour is one of those unique ingredients that will settle, which means when I measure a cup of flour and you measure a cup of flour, they could turn out to be entirely different weights, which means we have an entirely different amount of flour, which can end up messing up your recipe or your end product. Professional bakers in particular, and I really hope that home cooks go this direction, use scales. This being that I have a higher level of quality control. 2 ounces of flour by weight is 2 ounces of flour by weight, regardless of how much volume it takes up. So that's what we're going to do here today. If you notice, it says 20 ounces of AP flour. If you don't have a small scale at home, I really like this one. I got it as a gift recently. It's been my new favorite. I've had others that have a pull-out screen and are different sizes. You're looking for something that measures at least 9 to 13 pounds just because your bowls that you'll be measuring into will weigh various amounts. So I'm going to go ahead and measure out the 20 ounces. If you don't have a scale at home, either send me a message, or if you look on, there are plenty of converters online where you can put in the weight of your ingredient and it'll give you the volumetric measurement. But like I said again, please make sure you're scooping from your flour into your measuring cup and then scraping off the top. Don't tap on the table, don't pat it down. That will end up making your recipe really dry. Okay, so I have my bowl on, I turned my scale on. I'm going to go ahead and tear that out, so make it 0. That way I have a nice even measurement. And then I'm just going to measure out my 20 ounces of flour. Okay, so if we look at the recipe for this particular dough, our starting product, we start by combining our wet ingredients. So when we say wet ingredients, we pretty much mean anything that includes eggs, butters, liquids, yeast, and generally sugars as well, unless the recipe tells you otherwise. So we're combining the 4 yolks with a single egg, which, sorry, I said it off camera. 4 yolks with a single egg, our 2 ounces of sugar, our 6 ounces of melted butter, and our 3/4 cup of buttermilk. And we're going to include that into our mixing bowl. So I can go ahead and add that all in. I know the yeast at this point is in a liquid state, but we're not going to add that just yet. And part of that has to do with the fact that we substituted out active yeast, which we needed to activate, as opposed to the instant yeast, which will go into your recipe dry if that's what you happen to have. Okay, so once I have all my ingredients in, per the recipe, I can go ahead and start mixing it with a whisk. Now, your recipe will tell you different attachments if you're using an electric mixer to use. Please follow these because they each have a different purpose. And we'll see that more once we get to the dough hook portion in a little bit. All right, so this is kind of noisy. I'm going to go ahead and start whisking this, and then I will get back to you. So the instructions call for me to whisk the wet ingredients until they are combined, and that's what I've got so far. Next, it says to go ahead and add in about 1/4 of my flour, my salt, and then the yeast. Normally, like I said, this yeast would be in dry form, so it wouldn't be quite the same as what we have right now. We made Corona. But we make do, and we find ways to substitute, and there are plenty of substitutes in the baking world. So my salt, just to make my life easier, I'm going to combine my dries. I have 1 1/4 teaspoons. Even if it says to combine ahead of time, if you are using active yeast, like the kind that I have right here, please do not add salt to it itself. The salt will kill the yeast, and it'll actually reduce the ability of the bread to rise. So I'm going to go ahead and add my yeast in first. I've mixed in my salt and my flour just up at the top because I know I may not end up adding all of my flour, but we'll get to that later. Okay. Try and keep your station as clean as possible, combining dishes so that you can take them later to go wash. All right, next I'm going to go ahead and add about 1/4 of my flour. And I'm going to use the whisk to combine that. If you need to scrape down the bowl at any point in time, for this or other recipes, please make sure that you turn your mixer off first, or you could do damage to the attachments you have. Okay, so now I've gotten to the point where I've combined all my ingredients with about 1/4 of the flour, and at this point I'm going to switch over to both A, more flour, and B, to the dough hook, a different attachment for a KitchenAid. The dough hook is your best friend if you enjoy making any type of bread. From experience, kneading bread by hand for the entire portion will give you a very intense workout. You won't be able to lift your arms above your head the next day. So, I love our modern appliances and the dough hook. All right, so I've scraped on the sides of my bowl. I'm going to add in all but about 4 ounces. No, you don't need to measure this. You can totally estimate. It's fine. What we're doing here is we over-measured our flour with the goal of having some to add. Yeast breads can be picky in the amount of moisture that they need, and so we want to make sure our dough is not too wet or too dry. Additionally, based on the shelf life or how old flour is, it can take in more or less moisture. So always give yourself wiggle rooms when you're making breads. Start off on low and allow the dough to incorporate. This will go for about 5 minutes and then we'll come back. Okay, so at this point we've gone ahead and we've been mixing our dough with the dough hook for about 5 minutes. Now what you're looking for with your dough is that it is moist but not sticky. So if I go ahead and I look here, it's actually pretty good. It's still not quite pulling away from the side, so I'm going to add just like a smidge more flour, and I am going to scrape the bowl and just see what happens when I throw it back on the mixer again. And when I said a smidge, I mean like a dusting, mainly because this is looking pretty solid. I could turn it out, but if I were to knead it at this point, it would still kind of stick to my fingers, and I'm looking for just a little bit more cohesion at this point. So I threw my dusting on, I scraped the sides of the bowl to help the dough pull away a bit. We're going to turn it back on medium for a second and just see if it's ready. All right, so at this point, I know my dough's ready. It's pulled away from the sides of the bowl. I don't know if you can see. And now I'm going to turn it out into a clean floured surface. So my workspace is clean here. And one of the things I like about a center island like this is that it has that built-in wooden board, so I know that it's ready to go. All right, you do want to lightly dust the surface you're going to be turning the bread out onto. So in this case, I still have that leftover 4 ounces of flour. I like to put it in my fingers, keep my fingers loose, and then just gently shake, and it'll work the same almost like a flour sifter. I'm not looking to full on coat. I'm just looking to create a barrier between my dough and the workspace to help it not stick as I go through and knead. So I'm taking it off of the dough hook, step one, and then I'm going to turn it out from the mixing bowl onto my surface. And a lot of times if you just take your bowl, especially if you're working with a larger dough or a heavier dough, and you tilt, you can let the dough do a bunch of the work for you. Now in this case I still have a little bit more in there. I'm going to scrape to make sure I get all of that because cinnamon rolls. And then before I let this do its initial proof, I am going to go ahead and do a quick hand knead really quick. When I knead, I'm pulling the dough towards me, I'm pushing away, and then I'm doing a turn. And in this case, like I said, you're going to want that flour. And it's almost like I'm continually folding over. You don't want to push so hard that you're breaking those gluten strands that have formed. So if you know, nothing is tearing as I'm kneading the dough. And I want to knead for about 30 seconds. Now, bread is interesting, and I know gluten has been a big buzzword in the past few decades as people are coming out and realizing they have gluten sensitivities or in some cases gluten allergies, but gluten is what gives bread its structure. It is a protein, and as you go through, it's any wheat product. So anything that comes from wheat that has wheat flour. There are a handful of other flours as well, but the majority of it is wheat. So for example, when I used to work in restaurants, we would get people who were still learning, and they would ask questions like, well, are the potatoes gluten-free? Is the rice gluten-free? As long as it doesn't have wheat in it, it should be gluten-free. There are some exceptions, but I can get to that in another video. So as I'm kneading, I'm helping those gluten strands, those proteins, to develop, and they're creating a structure. This structure is what's going to hold in those little gaseous bubbles that my yeast is going to produce, and they're going to create those little crumbs or those little air pockets in the dough. If you cut open a slice of bread and you look and you see all those little air pockets, that's the structure of the gluten capturing the bubbles produced by your leavener, in this case yeast, and holding them in to give your bread its structure. Okay, so I've been kneading for about 30 to 60 seconds. I have a nice little bowl here, a nice little round guy. I have my seam at the bottom because that's just what I like to do. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to allow it to rise or do an initial proof for about 2.5 hours. Now, a few quick things. I have a bowl. Mine happens to have a lid that goes along with it. If you don't have a lid, you can go ahead and either cover with a towel, plastic wrap. You just want to make sure that nothing's going to stick to your dough here. So first thing, I'm going to lightly oil the bowl itself. This will help the dough not to stick to the bowl. And I can go ahead and put that guy in. We also want to prevent the dough from going ahead and forming a skin on the top. This will be a dry, crusty part. I want a nice, delicate dough. So I'm also going to go ahead and lightly oil the top of the dough itself. Once I've done that, I can go ahead and I can put a covering on, in this case my lid, and find a place for it to sit. Now you do want to make sure this is at room temperature. If it's a little warm, that's fine. You don't want it too hot, so you wouldn't put it like directly on top of a turned on oven. And you also don't want it cold. Do not put this in your fridge at this point. It will slow the yeast down. It'll make it go to sleep, and then you won't get that nice rise and that nice proof. Okay, so this is going to go ahead and sit for 2.5 hours. I'm going to come back right before we're ready to play with this, and we're going to make our filling for our cinnamon rolls. Then we're going to let this guy do its final proof in cinnamon roll form in its baking dish overnight in the fridge. And then we'll have cinnamon rolls fresh in the morning. Okay, so now that our dough has been proofing for its initial proof, about 2.5 hours, we can see that it's risen to about double its initial size. At this point, we're going to get ready to start rolling it out and putting together our cinnamon rolls. Now, just a reminder, once we've put these together, we put them into our Pyrex dish, we're going to go in the refrigerator overnight, and that way we can pop them out in the morning and go ahead and bake our cinnamon rolls fresh for breakfast. So before I start rolling this, I want to make sure that my filling is ready to go. So in a bowl, I'm going to go ahead and put 8 ounces, and once again, this is by weight. And if you do not have a scale, we can look up the conversions, or you can send me a message and I'll give you a conversion. So 8 ounces by weight of brown sugar. We're going to go with about a tablespoon of cinnamon. And I usually tend to go, if it asks for cinnamon for a recipe such as this, with a generous tablespoon. In recipes, if you see a large tea, we're talking about tablespoons. Small teas refer to teaspoons. This particular brand of ground cinnamon is Morton and Bassett, and they're really nice. You can find them at most stores, and they are a San Francisco brand. The recipe doesn't call for it, but generally with baked goods, I like to toss in a little bit of either vanilla or almond extract. In this case, it's going to be vanilla, just a smidge. And then we're going to go ahead and look at our 1.5 ounces of melted butter. Or excuse me, 1.5 tablespoons, so about 0.75 ounces if you're going by weight. Okay, so I'm going to mix this together. You can do it in a mixer, but that's just a little bit more than what you really need to do. You'll create unnecessary dishes for yourself, and this is something that's really easy just to mix together in a bowl. In my case, I like to use a spatula. There really, like I said, is no need for an appliance for this step. Once we have this mixture put together, we're going to set it aside, roll out our dough to 12 by 18 inches, nice rectangle. We're going to sprinkle this on our dough, and then we're going to go ahead and roll them into the cinnamon roll shape that you know, and cut and place them into our dish to proof overnight for that final proof. Once you've mixed all these items together, it will resemble kind of a wet sand. You really want to make sure that you have mixed them well, otherwise you'll get these odd pockets that are super cinnamony, and cinnamon can be very dry, and it's not a great taste or a feel in the mouth. Alright, so there's my mixture. I'm going to go ahead and bring the camera in closer so you can see how we're going to roll this dough out, and we'll continue from there. Okay, so before we place our cinnamon rolls into our baking dish to proof overnight in the fridge, we're going to go ahead and butter our dish. This helps us to make sure that the cinnamon rolls come out cleanly when we're done baking, and so that they have a nice little bit of a crust and some flavor development on the bottom. I happen to like this dish a lot. The recipe calls for a 9 by 13 inch Pyrex or glass dish. This one comes with its own lid, making it very easy for me to put away into that fridge overnight to do its last proof. I'm going to take off the lid, and if you notice, the recipe asks for you to butter the dish, like I talked about, but you do have two options. So if you know your household goes through a lot of butter and you're going to be baking later in the week, go ahead and save the wrappers that the butter sticks come in. You can use those to butter any dish. It's kind of like a little built-in system. If you forgot or you don't happen to have the wrappers, you can go ahead and soften some butter. You just need it so it's nice and pliable, and I use a paper towel so I don't get my fingers super messy, and I can go ahead and just wipe it along the bottom of the dish. You want to make sure you get especially into the corners. That's the part where the dough tends to stick the most. And that's also where you'll have the most difficulty getting those items out once they're done baking. The other benefit to using a paper towel like I'm doing is if you don't use up all the butter, you haven't contaminated the leftovers. So you can go ahead and just put a cover on them and put it back in the fridge and use it again later. Once you've stuck your fingers in those butters, nobody's really going to want to use it to put on their toast later. All right, it doesn't need to be huge giant globs. We're just looking for a nice clean layer where everything is coated. So for example, here's my buttered dish. All right. Okay, so set off to my side, I have my mixed filling. Now I'm going to go ahead and prep the dough. What we're looking for when we're all done is we're looking to go ahead and have an 18-inch by 12-inch rectangle. Beware, dough, especially a risen dough like this, tends to be, or at least a cinnamon roll, dough tends to be a little bit tackier or stickier, which means we do want to, like before, flour our working surface. So now I'm going to roll my dough out onto the cutting board and lightly dust the top. The nice thing about this particular rolling pin is that it happens to be exactly 18 inches wide, so I can use it as a way to measure my dough while I'm rolling out to get the 18 by 12 shape.
Please be careful that when you're rolling, you're not pushing the dough because you're stretching it out too much, but you're actually just gently rolling across and pushing down. You're moving back and forth in order to create the shape that you want, and yes, it's going to be oval first, but you can start to work from the center out to the corners in order to get that rectangular shape. Once I hit about 18 by 12, going a little bit over because there will be stretch back, you can go ahead and check to make sure that your dough hasn't stuck to the bottom of the cutting board. If you need to reflour, do it, double check your size, and you should be just about good to go.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and put the rolling pin away now. I'm pretty much done. Get some of this, but it's not too bad. Now here's where I'm gonna start looking at my filling. This is also where we can use our hands a little bit, and I'm gonna dust it on. Now, the filling will prevent the dough from sticking to itself. So I wanna make sure that I put my filling on evenly, but I leave this top portion of the dough up here blank or devoid of filling. This will help me when I go to roll the cinnamon rolls later. You also want to make sure that it's pretty even. You don't want one person getting far too much filling and somebody else not getting any at all. Once you've got it on, you can spread it out a little bit, so don't worry too much about being super careful the first time you drop it in. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and spread my filling out so that it's fairly even, leaving that top section free of filling. There are other ways you can make cinnamon rolls. Some of them end up mixing their filling into almost a paste, and you'll spread that on. That's great too. This is a nice one though because it kind of eliminates that step, and you worry less about tearing or stretching your dough when you're spreading that filling out. Okay, so now that I've got my filling on, I'm going to start from the end closest to me, and I'm going to roll the dough out. And you really want to make sure it's a tight roll. So we're going to do a little bit at a time. If you roll the cinnamon rolls up and they're too loose, you'll find that the dough or the roll will start to come apart when you go to pick it up later or when it's baking. After you get the initial part going, it's a little bit easier to kind of roll the cinnamon roll as one unit. Okay, so now that we've got our cinnamon roll set up, rolled, ready to go, I'm going to go ahead and start slicing them into our cinnamon rolls to go into our baking dish. We're looking for 12 cinnamon rolls total, so the easiest way for me to do that is to cut my roll in half first. So for me, I can do an eyeball judge with my fingers and kind of figure out where that halfway mark is. Now if you notice, I'm using a serrated knife. This will help with dough. If it gets sticky at all or you find the dough sticking to it, you can go ahead and rinse it off or do a wipe. With knives, the sharper, the safer. When knives are dull, you're more likely to slip or to catch on something and cut yourself. Most knife-related kitchen injuries occur when we're looking at dull knives. Also, please always be aware of where your fingers are whenever you're working with knives. Because I'm going through and cutting, I'm leaning it up against, but I'm turning the blade slightly away from myself. So, I know that I'm going to cut 12 total, so I'm going to do 4 groupings. It's the easiest way for me to kind of keep it even. So I've got my half, and I can do another little mark for halfway of each half. So now I've got my dough into fourths. And from here, I can go ahead and cut thirds. You could measure it, but to be perfectly honest, eyeball will be fine. These are for breakfast cinnamon rolls. They're not for something that is super precise. They'll kind of rise in their own way anyway. So I'm just gonna go through. If I know that the end piece is a little stubbier, because it's kind of got that tapered edge, then I may cut it a little bit longer. You're looking for a nice little roll with your filling, and you'll see that as you go. The easiest way is to go through and cut everything first and then put it all into the dish. With serrated knives, we're not pushing down, you're not squishing the dough. I'm gently sawing back and forth and letting the knife do most of the work, just like with the rolling pin. When you cut bread, this is also the same technique. You're going to go ahead and use a serrated knife and cut down and let the knife do all of the work. All right, so my little guys at the end, they're a little wonky in their shape. I'm going to put them in the center so the other cinnamon rolls support them. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab and start filling my cinnamon rolls in. If I know I have 12, the easiest thing is just for me to do 4 rows of 3. And I usually go corners. Then I do my ends. Here's my spacing. And there will be space between the cinnamon rolls. This is normal. Don't forget, this dough is going to go through another proof, which means it's going to poof up again. So you want to have that room for growth. At this point, we're done for tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and put my lid on my cinnamon rolls, pop them in my fridge, and the next steps will be in the morning. Sweet dreams. All right, so in the event you don't have a scale and you're still a little confused as to how to convert weight measurements into volumetric measurements, so for example, cups. Here's kind of my quick and easy way. These are the same kind of ratios we set up in a lot of our math problems. So I know that 1 cup of flour, AP flour, equals about 4.5 ounces. That's how much it weighs. So if I know my recipe calls for 20 ounces of flour, then I can set up a basic ratio. Don't forget, with these types of ratios, if you remember from math, we're looking to cancel out units. So ounces to ounces, and that gives us our cups at the end. So my 20 ounces of flour, and my ratio here is 1 cup equals 4.5 ounces, and then I can divide or cross multiply, and that leaves me with cups as my unit. So I know I have 4 cups of flour plus a remaining 2 ounces of weight. So I can go back down here and do my next layer. 2 ounces, once again, those are my starting units, and I'm looking to get to tablespoons, something smaller than cups. 1 cup is the equivalent of 4.5 ounces, so I'm cross multiplying there, but I'm adding an extra step this time to get that last little chunk. I know that 1 cup is the same as 16 tablespoons. So once again, if I'm looking here, ounces to ounces cross out when I'm cross multiplying, cups to cups cross out when I'm cross multiplying, and I'm left with my desired unit, which is tablespoons, and I know it's a little bit more, so a rounded 7 tablespoons. Therefore, if I don't have a scale, I know that if I need 20 ounces by weight of AP flour, then I need 4 cups and 7 tablespoons, give or take a little bit extra. Hopefully this helps. Okay, now that my cinnamon rolls have come out of the oven after they've been in their makeshift proof box with the hot water on the shelf below, this is what they should look like, and this is at this point we're going to go ahead and pop them into our oven. Okay, now for the frosting, I'm going to go ahead and use my mixer again with my mixing bowl, but this time instead of the whisk or the dough hook, I'm going to use the paddle attachment. This is great for frostings, for creaming butter and sugar when you're going ahead to make cookies, anything else that needs a little more oomph, but not quite as much as that dough hook. I'm going to start off by putting my cream cheese in, and I'm going to go ahead and put this on and open it up a little bit, soften it up while I get my other ingredients going. Okay, with a small batch like this, you really have to make sure you scrape the bowl periodically because the ingredients will go off into the sides. They don't have quite as much to work with. So next I'm gonna go ahead and add in my milk. And I'm gonna put this on again. Please start on slow or you will splatter the kitchen with liquids. And once that's incorporated, then I will go ahead and take it off again and sift in my flour. The goal here is to try and get as many of the lumps out as possible before we start adding in our dries, which would be our powdered sugars. If you notice in the recipe, it asks you to sift in the powdered sugar. This helps prevent excessive lumps. Alright, now that I've got all my flour sifted into the bowl, I'm going to put it back on the mixer, once again starting at the lowest possible speed. Alright, if you notice, it's starting to look like the frosting that you find at Cinnabon. It's same in color, very similar in texture. I need to scrape down the bowl one more time before I do a final mix, and it's at this point that I'm going to add in my orange zest. Because this is such a small batch, I'm not going to add in a full orange's worth of zest. I'll do about half. I want that flavor to accent, but I don't want it to overpower the other flavors that are already there. And now here's my finished frosting. I can go ahead and set this aside for when the cinnamon rolls come out of the oven. They'll be good to go. Okay, now that our cinnamon rolls have been in the oven for half an hour, they've got some beautiful color on them. I used a thermometer to go ahead and check the temp of my cinnamon rolls. They've gotten up to at least 190 degrees, which means I know they're cooked all the way through in the center. Next, while they're still warm, I can go ahead and take my frosting and apply pretty liberally. The nice thing is, when the cinnamon rolls are still warm, that frosting will go through and melt and get into all the pockets of the cinnamon rolls.